That evening, I placed the final dish on the table and sat down like a dutiful wife. 13 plates, 13 wine glasses, 13 guests who believed they were celebrating a major deal. No one suspected the most dangerous thing served tonight was not the food. My husband thought he was flaunting his power, unaware I had spent months quietly organizing his ruin. The cruelest part was not screaming or crying. I simply let the truth speak. My name is Isla Green. I am 39 years old, living in the quiet, manicured suburbs of Madison Heights, Ohio. To the casual observer, my life is a portrait of suburban tranquility, defined by a beautifully appointed home, a successful husband, and an aura of effortless domestic grace. I am known in our social circles as a woman who is calm, meticulous, and impeccably organized. What they do not see, what almost no one sees, is that I have spent over a decade functioning as the invisible, exhaustively overworked engine room of my husband's corporate machine. I am the shadow behind the spotlight, the architect of stability in a world built on his precarious ambitions, and I have done it all with barely a whisper of recognition. It was the morning of the 8th of March. The sun had barely managed to break through the persistent, gray Ohio overcast, casting a pale, sterile light across my kitchen island. I stood there, my hands lightly dusted with premium flour, methodically kneading dough for a fresh brioche. To my immediate left, pushed safely away from the flour, my sleek silver laptop sat open. The screen displayed a sprawling, complex spreadsheet detailing the accounts payable for North Briar Development Group. I was mentally charting out the weekly payroll, projecting cash flow for the next fiscal quarter, and simultaneously feeling the satisfying, elastic resistance of the dough beneath the heels of my palms. It was a morning like any other, defined entirely by the dual acts of domestic creation and corporate preservation. Then, the smooth glass surface of my phone lit up, vibrating with a harsh, buzzing sound against the marble countertop. It was a message from my husband, Gavin Green. I wiped a floury hand on my linen apron, leaving a white smudge against the dark fabric, and tapped the screen to read the notification. The text was characteristically brief, devoid of any warmth, greeting, or basic human courtesy. Cook tonight for 13 people. Make it look good. I stared at the glowing words. 13 guests. A dinner party of that size required days of careful planning, sourcing specific ingredients from specialty grocers, and hours of intensive preparation. To drop such a demand on me on a Tuesday morning was an act of profound entitlement. Yet, it was not entirely out of character for Gavin. I released a slow, measured breath, mentally calculating the hours I had left before the evening, preparing to completely dismantle and rearrange my entire schedule to accommodate his sudden, dictatorial whim. Before I could even set the phone down to review my pantry inventory, it buzzed a second time. Daphne likes grilled ribs. Do not forget the peach cobbler. Important partners. I stood perfectly still. There was no good morning. There was no please. There was certainly no thank you. And by given the specific date on the calendar, there was absolutely no acknowledgement that today was International Women's Day. Outside these walls, the world was actively celebrating the achievements, the labor, and the value of women. Inside my kitchen, my husband was ordering me to cater to his professional and personal whims without a shred of gratitude, but it was the name Daphne Vale that made my hands stop moving entirely. The dough sat heavy and inert on the cold counter. Daphne. It was a name that had been quietly, insidiously bleeding into the margins of my life for months. At first, it was just a casual mention in passing. A new, supposedly brilliant consultant hired to refresh the company's outdated image. Then, her name began appearing in the copy line of late-night work emails. Soon after that, I started noticing the hushed phone calls Gavin would take out on the back patio, his voice dropping to a low, intimate murmur that he had not used with me in over 5 years. And then came the financial anomalies, the invoices, generous, recurring payments explicitly categorized as brand consulting that the person who scrutinized every single outflow of cash from the corporate accounts, could never quite trace back to any tangible, verifiable deliverables. Gavin had always been a man who loved the blinding glare of the spotlight. He thrived in the center of any room, armed with a charismatic smile, a firm handshake, and a heavily rehearsed pitch. He had successfully built a grand narrative around Northbriar Development Group, aggressively selling it to the community and investors as the singular, magnificent triumph of a self-made visionary. He was the face of the operation, the bold risk-taker who envisioned towering structures, but I was the spine. Without me, Gavin was just a hollow man making expensive promises he could not afford to keep. I was the one who meticulously tracked the complex subcontractor agreements, managed the delicate, often delayed payment schedules, and caught the reckless, arrogant accounting errors that would have easily invited catastrophic tax audits. I maintained the fragile ecosystem of cash flow that kept his visionary projects from sinking into a mire of bankruptcy. Yet, whenever we hosted lavish dinners or attended formal industry galas, Gavin had a favorite, well-worn joke he loved to deploy for his audience. He would wrap a heavy arm around my waist, flash his blinding smile at his investors, and say, "Isla stays home for fun. She is my domestic goddess. I handle the heavy lifting in the concrete jungle so she can stay here and perfect her pie crusts." The guests would always laugh. I would always smile a tight, practiced, agreeable smile. I would never correct him in public. I would never point out that earlier that very same day, I had spent 3 agonizing hours on the phone negotiating a critical grace period with our primary lumber supplier simply because Gavin had forgotten to authorize the necessary wire transfer while he was playing golf. I allowed him his pride, his inflated ego, because I believed, rather foolishly, that we were an unbreakable team. I believed my silent, relentless labor was a necessary investment in our shared future and our shared security. But staring at that second text message, staring at the name Daphne glowing on the screen, the grand illusion finally and permanently shattered. Daphne likes grilled ribs. It was not merely the blatant, insulting demand to cater to the specific culinary preferences of a woman I deeply suspected was his mistress, right in the heart of my own home. It was the absolute, casual, unthinking cruelty of the instruction. It was the stark realization that Gavin did not see me as a partner, a wife, or even a human being with a basic threshold for disrespect. He saw me as a high-functioning appliance. I was a free, highly efficient management system designed to keep his business out of legal trouble, and an unpaid, obedient catering service designed to elevate his personal and social standing. I looked away from the phone and stared out the kitchen window at the manicured lawn. The irony tasted like ash in my mouth. Today was the 8th of March. The radio was likely playing segments about breaking glass ceilings and empowering female voices. Meanwhile, I was expected to marinate meat for the woman dismantling my marriage, using the very grocery money I had meticulously budgeted. A normal woman might have thrown the expensive smartphone against the marble backsplash. A normal woman might have called him immediately, screaming into the receiver, demanding explanations, hurling accusations, and threatening a brutal divorce right then and there. She might have collapsed onto the hardwood floor, weeping into her apron, violently mourning the long decade of her youth that she had poured directly into a man who viewed her with such profound, casual contempt. I did none of those things. Instead, I felt a strange, sweeping, deeply unsettling sensation wash over me. It was not a fiery, blinding, chaotic rage. It was the exact, chilling opposite. It was an ice-cold, crystalline clarity that seemed to freeze the blood in my veins. The anger bypassed the loud, messy, reactive emotional centers of my brain and settled directly, heavily, into the deepest, quietest parts of my logic. The slight, almost imperceptible trembling in my fingers vanished. My heartbeat, which had momentarily spiked at the initial sight of Daphne's name, slowed down to a steady, rhythmic, almost mechanical thud. This abnormal, heavy calmness was perhaps the most terrifying thing I had ever experienced in my entire life, and it belonged entirely to me. It was the profound, unshakable silence of a woman who has suddenly and permanently realized she is completely finished arguing. There was no longer any desperate desire to confront him, to demand to be seen, to force him into acknowledging my worth, or to beg for the fundamental respect I had earned 1,000 times over. You do not argue with a parasite. You simply systematically remove it from your host system. I looked down at the pale dough resting on the counter. I looked over at the complex financial spreadsheet glowing on the laptop screen. The two distinct halves of my invisible, unappreciated life. Gavin truly believed he held all the power in our dynamic simply because his name was embossed on the corporate letterhead and his voice was the loudest in the boardroom. He fundamentally, tragically misunderstood the actual architecture of his own success. He did not realize that the person who controls the ledgers controls the absolute reality of the situation. He wanted me to cook an impressive dinner for 13 people. He wanted it to look incredibly good. He wanted to secure his important partners and dazzle his brand consultant with my domestic perfection. I picked up my phone. My fingers flew across the digital keyboard, my movements precise, deliberate, and entirely devoid of hesitation. Consider it done. It will be a dinner no one will ever forget. I hit send. I did not mean it as a petty emotional threat. I meant it as an ironclad guarantee. I set the phone down face down on the marble. I turned my back to the baking supplies and walked over to the laptop. I closed the routine accounts payable spreadsheet. My fingers hovered over the trackpad for a fraction of a second before I opened a new, heavily encrypted folder hidden deep within the system. It was time to pull the first set of raw withdrawal records. The exhausting era of being the supportive, invisible wife had just abruptly ended. The time for the quiet, devastating, and entirely factual audit of Gavin Green's life had officially begun. The unraveling did not begin this morning. The actual thread started pulling free exactly 4 months and 12 days ago, under the fluorescent hum of our local bank branch. I was there on a brisk Tuesday afternoon to process a routine earnest money deposit for a new commercial lot. I knew the teller, a sweet woman named Brenda, who always asked about my garden. As she clicked through her system to bypass a minor routing error, she turned her monitor slightly toward me. Which account? Mrs. Green, the primary operating fund or the secondary corporate reserve? I froze. The pen in my hand suddenly felt entirely foreign. I managed all the books. I reconciled every ledger. There was no secondary corporate reserve. The primary, Brenda, I said, my voice dangerously even. And could you print a summary of the accounts currently linked to North Briar's tax identification number for my internal audit? She handed me the slip of paper. There it was. An account holding a negligible balance, but active, completely walled off from my administrative access. My name was absent from the authorized signers list. In 11 years, Gavin had never opened a financial vessel without my explicit structuring. That night, the house was perfectly quiet, except for the muffled, rhythmic drumming of water hitting the porcelain tiles in the master bathroom. Gavin was taking one of his famously long, scalding showers. I sat at my desk in the den, the glow of the monitor casting long shadows against the walls. I bypassed the standard employee portal and used the master administrative credentials I had set up years ago. These were credentials Gavin assumed I only used for tax season. I dove straight into the general ledger, hunting for the routing number I had memorized at the bank. I found the leak almost immediately. It was not a sudden hemorrhage. It was a slow, deliberate siphon. A series of automated clearinghouse transfers were cleanly routed from the primary operating account to the hidden reserve, and from there, directly into the corporate account of a vendor listed as Vail Consulting. I opened the vendor file. I stared at the payment history. The amounts were staggering, especially for a mid-sized development firm facing rising material costs. There was a wire for $4,800. 3 weeks later, another for $7,200. Then, a massive transfer of $11,000. Each invoice was meticulously coded with the kind of corporate word salad that practically begs to be ignored by lazy auditors. Brand refinement, client hospitality strategy, executive image alignment. I pulled up the master project files. Whenever we hired external consultants, there were extensive contracts, scope of work documents, and tangible deliverables. I searched for Daphne Vale. I searched for Vale Consulting. There were no project briefs. There were no marketing decks. There was absolutely nothing to justify why this woman was draining tens of thousands of dollars from a company that was currently struggling to secure basic permits. My fingers moved across the keyboard with a frantic, icy precision. I pivoted from the accounting software to the company's email server. As the system administrator, I had unrestricted access to all internal communications. I queried Gavin's inbox for her name. The results loaded instantly. The professional facade of the emails crumbled within the first 3 clicks. There were no discussions of brand strategy. Instead, I found a digital trail of profound disrespect. There were cryptic messages about undeclared afternoon meetings. There were forwarded reservations for a highly exclusive, ridiculously expensive boutique hotel located in downtown Columbus, booked for a Tuesday night when Gavin had claimed to be touring a prospective site with a zoning board member. There was a photograph attached to one thread showing 2 glasses of amber liquid resting on a mahogany bar. Her manicured hand resting casually over his wrist. A lesser woman would have felt her heart shatter. I felt a different kind of breaking. It was the snapping of a tether. The sheer cliché of it all was almost insulting. My husband, a man who prided himself on his sharp intellect and cunning business acumen, was risking his entire empire for a woman who labeled her affair as client hospitality strategy. But as I sat there, listening to the shower shut off down the hall, the true weight of the situation settled over me. The adultery was painful. Yes, it was a sharp, humiliating sting. Yet, the real, unforgivable betrayal was not happening in a hotel room in Columbus. The real betrayal was happening right here, on these digital ledgers. Gavin was not just cheating on me. He was actively embezzling from his own company to fund his infidelity. I pulled up the accounts payable report. At that exact moment, we were 45 days past due on a payment to our primary drywall contractor. We owed a structural engineering firm over $50,000. I had spent the last 2 weeks placating angry vendors, begging for extensions, and manipulating our cash reserves to keep the project sites operational. Meanwhile, Gavin was siphoning critical capital to align his executive image with a woman named Daphne. Worse still, I knew exactly what Gavin had presented to our primary investors just 3 days prior. He had handed them a glossy, highly curated financial summary that completely omitted these massive capital leaks. He had manipulated the profit margins to make the company appear incredibly flush with cash. He was committing financial fraud, and because my name was on the administrative filings, because I was the one who generated the tax documents, he was directly implicating me in his crimes. He was building a house of cards, and he was using my spotless reputation as the foundation. The bathroom door creaked open down the hall. I heard Gavin humming, completely oblivious to the fact that his entire digital life was currently laid bare on my screen. I did not slam the laptop shut. I did not storm down the hallway to confront him with the printed emails. Anger is a messy, volatile chemical reaction. It burns hot, it burns fast, and it almost always leaves the person wielding it covered in ash. I needed something far more durable than anger. I needed leverage. I minimized the email server. I opened a new, secure, encrypted drive. I began the tedious, methodical process of digital preservation. I exported the general ledger as a raw data file. I took high-resolution screenshots of the vendor payment history, ensuring the time and date stamps were clearly visible in the bottom corner of the screen. I downloaded the hotel receipts, the flight confirmations, and the email threads, converting them into secure documents. I pulled the internal access logs, definitively proving that Gavin's unique user identification was the one approving the transfers to Vale Consulting. I created a mirror image of the company's true financial state, showing the delayed contractor payments, the dwindling cash reserves, the inflated investor reports, and placed it right next to the documentation of his affair. I worked in absolute silence. I was no longer a wife discovering her husband's infidelity. I was a forensic accountant securing a crime scene. For months, I maintained this agonizing double life. Every morning, I poured his coffee, kissed his cheek, and listened to him complain about the stress of the business. Every night, while he slept, I updated my hidden archive. I tracked every dollar stolen. I cataloged every lie told to an investor. I watched him dig his own grave, millimeter by millimeter, and I quietly documented the dimensions of the hole. I knew that if I confronted him with tears and accusations, he would simply gaslight me. He would tell me I was crazy, that I was misinterpreting the data, that it was all a complex tax strategy I simply did not understand. He would lock me out of the system, destroy the evidence, and spin a narrative that painted me as a hysterical, jealous housewife. I refused to give him that opportunity. When the time came to finally dismantle the lie we were living, I would not speak with the tremor of a broken heart. I would speak with the cold, irrefutable authority of a certified financial record. The numbers did not know how to lie. They did not care about his charisma or his tailored suits. They simply existed, stark and unforgiving. And I had spent the last 4 months making absolutely sure that when they finally spoke, they would scream. The drive to the artisanal butcher shop on the west side of town was entirely uneventful. The sky remained a flat, slate gray, mirroring the strange, absolute stillness that had settled behind my ribs. I parked my heavy utility vehicle and walked into the shop, the brass bell above the heavy glass door chiming a cheerful, mundane greeting. I ordered 5 racks of their most expensive, prime-cut beef ribs. I watched the butcher wrap the heavily marbled meat in thick brown butcher paper. Next, I drove to the organic grocer. I selected firm, fragrant peaches for the cobbler, crisp Boss pears, and a large bag of raw pecans for the salad. I chose heavy cream, unsalted butter, and fresh sprigs of thyme. I moved through the aisles with the practiced, seamless efficiency of a woman who had orchestrated hundreds of these high-stakes corporate evenings. I was buying the ammunition for my husband's own firing squad, and I paid for every single item using his secondary platinum credit card. My reasoning for this elaborate domestic performance was exceptionally simple. If tonight was meant to be the grand stage Gavin had carefully constructed to flex his influence and display his perceived dominance over his peers, then I would ensure the set design was utterly flawless. I would make the food so exquisite, the ambiance so perfectly curated, and my own demeanor so graciously accommodating that absolutely no one in that room would suspect I was the one holding the remote detonator. A poorly executed dinner, burnt edges, or a sour attitude would only make me look bitter or incompetent, giving him an easy excuse to dismiss my presence. A perfect dinner, however, would lull 13 ambitious, calculating people into a state of absolute, vulnerable comfort, returning home. I tied my heavy canvas apron back on and began the physical labor. There is a profound, grounding rhythm to cooking that requires your hands to stay busy while your mind roams free. I crushed whole cloves of garlic with the flat steel blade of my chef's knife. I whisked together dark brown sugar, apple cider vinegar, and a heavy pour of aged bourbon to create a thick, glossy glaze for the meat. The sharp, acidic tang of the vinegar cut through the sweet, heavy air of the kitchen. I massaged a dry rub of smoked paprika, coarse sea salt, and cracked black pepper into the beef, feeling the cold, dense texture of the tissue under my fingertips. I peeled the peaches, their bright orange flesh slipping easily from the skins under the edge of a paring knife, and tossed them with cinnamon and a generous dash of freshly grated nutmeg. My hands were entirely occupied with the creation of domestic warmth, but my mind was operating like a highly calibrated, merciless machine. While the ribs began their long, slow braise in the heavy iron oven, I washed my hands, dried them thoroughly on a fresh linen towel, and walked down the hall to my home office. The air in this room always felt different to me, cooler and distinctly sharper. I woke my computer monitor and sent the meticulously organized financial files to the high-capacity laser printer. The machine whirred to life, rhythmically spitting out crisp, warm sheets of paper into the plastic tray. I arranged 3 distinct, towering stacks on my polished mahogany desk. The first stack contained the categorized lists of personal cash distributions, cross-referenced exactly with the dates of our most critical cash flow shortages. The second stack was a comprehensive, undeniable summary of vendor debt, highlighting the exact contractors who had been actively stonewalled and blatantly lied to about our corporate liquidity. The third stack detailed the steady, parasitic flow of capital outward to the consulting firm owned by his mistress. I collated these pages into 13 neat, identical packets. I aligned the edges perfectly, tapping them against the wood. I used a heavy-duty stapler to bind them together, the sharp metal piercing the paper with a satisfying, decisive click. There was a brutal, poetic elegance to the trap resting on my desk. I had not fabricated a single digit. I had not exaggerated a single column. I had not inserted any emotional commentary, dramatic accusations, or subjective interpretations. This was the exact same raw data Gavin implicitly trusted me to manage, conceal, and manipulate to save him from ruin year after year. He firmly believed my quiet competence was his permanent, unbreakable shield. He never once considered that the shield could be turned sideways, sharpened, and driven straight into his professional chest. I carried the 13 packets back to the kitchen and placed them carefully inside the deep walk-in pantry, hidden safely behind a large silver serving platter on the bottom shelf. I did not want to leave them out on the dining table from the very beginning. Dropping a stack of financial documents like a theatrical bomb the moment the guests walked through the door was a tactic for someone desperate for cheap shock value. I wanted them to sit down. I wanted them to drink the expensive Cabernet I had allowed to breathe for hours. I wanted them to laugh at Gavin's rehearsed anecdotes and listen to his grandiose, empty promises about the future expansion of the company. I needed the grand illusion of his success to reach its absolute zenith before I shattered the glass beneath his feet. The higher he confidently climbed during the appetizer course, the harder he would hit the concrete during the main event. There was one final document to prepare before the guests arrived. I opened the top drawer of the kitchen island, the shallow one usually reserved for stray takeout menus and appliance warranty manuals. Inside, I placed a thick, sealed manila envelope. It contained a freshly drafted divorce petition, explicitly outlining irreconcilable differences. Beneath that standard petition lay a meticulously constructed portfolio proving my immense sweat equity, detailing my thousands of unpaid hours, my strategic interventions, and my sole management of the operational infrastructure. Attached to the very back was a ruthless business asset division proposal drafted by a corporate attorney I had quietly retained 3 weeks prior. It was my ironclad exit strategy, waiting silently among the polished silverware and measuring spoons. By 5 o'clock in the evening, it was time to change my clothes. I bypassed the elegant, tightly fitted cocktail dresses Gavin usually preferred me to wear when entertaining his wealthy investors. I had no desire to dress like a decorative trophy, nor did I want to dress like a combatant marching into a war zone. I chose a soft, cream-colored wool sweater and a pair of dark, expertly tailored trousers. I pulled my hair back into a low, smooth bun, fastening it securely at the nape of my neck so no loose strands would fall into my face. I applied only the barest minimum of makeup. When I looked in the full-length mirror leaning against the bedroom wall, I did not see a woman preparing to scream or throw wine. I saw a woman who looked impeccably clean, hyper-efficient, and entirely exhausted by the endless, degrading chore of begging to be acknowledged. I looked like a quiet ghost, which was perfectly fitting, because the dutiful blind wife he thought he had married was already dead and buried. As the digital clock on the stove ticked closer to 6 o'clock, the entire first floor of the house was heavily filled with the intoxicating, rich aroma of roasted meat, caramelized brown sugar, and melting butter. I walked into the dining room to conduct one final inspection. The massive table was set to absolute perfection. The heavy linen napkins were folded into crisp, sharp rectangles. The crystal water goblets caught the ambient light from the chandelier, casting small, fractured rainbows across the polished wood surface. The silver cutlery gleamed in absolute terrifying symmetry. Everything was beautiful. Everything was civilized. Everything was flawless. It looked exactly like a heavy, impossibly expensive tablecloth draped gracefully over a massive, gaping sinkhole, just waiting for someone to take the very first step. The heavy oak front door swung open at exactly 6:30. Miles Corbett was the first to arrive, his massive frame filling the entryway. Miles owned the largest independent lumber yard in the county and had been extending critical lines of credit to North Briar since our very first duplex build. Following closely behind him was Ronan Pike, a local private equity investor with sharp eyes and a perpetually calculating smirk, and Elliot Shaw, our primary capital partner whose firm held the heavily leveraged mortgages on our current commercial sites. A few major prospective clients trailed in shortly after. Wealthy couples primed to sign massive expansion contracts by the end of the fiscal quarter. I took their coats, feeling the heavy wool and silk beneath my hands, and directed them toward the living room where a crackling fire was already casting a warm, deceptive glow. The immediate chorus of predictable praise began the moment they stepped into the formal dining room and saw the meticulously curated table setting. "Isla, you have completely outdone yourself again," Miles boomed, accepting a crystal tumbler of single malt scotch from the tray I offered. "Gavin is a remarkably lucky man. I tell my own wife she needs to take lessons from you." "Thank you, Miles," I replied, my voice a perfect octave of gracious hostess humility. "Please, make yourself comfortable." Every compliment they casually offered felt like a precisely driven nail. "Gavin is so lucky. You are the perfect foundation for him." They saw my immaculate house, my perfectly tailored cream sweater, the delicate hors d'oeuvres I circulated on a heavy silver tray, and they concluded that I was merely the beautiful static scenery backing his grand production. They did not know that I was the one who had spent 3 grueling hours that very morning aggressively restructuring the payment schedule for Miles's lumber company just to prevent him from placing a devastating mechanic's lien on our flagship property. They firmly believed Gavin was the titan of industry, while I was simply the fortunate domestic beneficiary of his genius. I let them believe it. I moved silently through the crowded room, ensuring glasses were full and used napkins were replaced, positioning myself discreetly near small clusters of conversation. Near the stone fireplace, Elliot was gesturing expansively with his wine glass, holding court with the prospective clients. "Gavin is preparing to take the entire operation to the absolute next level," Elliot stated, his voice brimming with unearned confidence. "We are currently looking at opening a second regional branch by the end of the year. The cash flow is incredibly robust. He has built an absolute fortress." I stood mere inches away, offering a tray of warm, cheese-filled pastries. I smiled politely as a client took one. I listened to them confidently discuss a completely fictitious financial reality. They were pouring their immense trust and their substantial capital into a vivid, colorful painting that Gavin had simply sketched over a rotting canvas. They were completely unaware that the fortress they were praising was currently hemorrhaging capital to fund boutique hotel stays and designer clothing for a brand consultant. Every single guest in that room was a vital, load-bearing pillar of North Briar Development Group, and tonight they were all gathered under one roof, completely oblivious to the fact that the foundation was about to turn to dust. Gavin arrived at 7:15. He made his entrance with the practiced, breathless urgency of a man who firmly believed his time was vastly more valuable than anyone else's in the room. He pushed the front door open, shrugging off his expensive cashmere overcoat, instantly commanding the attention of the foyer, and walking right beside him, stepping confidently onto my imported runner rug, was Daphne Vale. She was noticeably younger than I was, perhaps late 20s or early 30s, radiating a sharp, aggressive kind of energy. She was dressed impeccably in a sleek, tailored emerald blazer and black silk trousers, an outfit chosen to broadcast professional dominance rather than polite guest etiquette. She carried herself with the relaxed, entitled posture of a woman who was entirely accustomed to occupying the spaces right next to my husband, spaces that socially and legally belonged exclusively to me. Gavin guided her into the living room, resting a hand on the small of her back for a fraction of a second too long. It was a microscopic gesture of possession that I caught instantly, even from across the room. "Apologies for the delay," "Everyone," Gavin announced loudly, flashing his trademark, charismatic grin. "A final site inspection ran late, but I want to introduce someone vital to our new direction. This is Daphne Vale. She is the brilliant mind driving our new brand image consulting initiative." He delivered the lie flawlessly. The pitch of his voice did not waver. He had clearly rehearsed this exact introduction, this precise normalization of his mistress into his professional sphere, multiple times. He was integrating her into the herd, right in front of his wife, believing his sheer audacity would shield him from any suspicion. I walked forward, holding a silver tray of empty champagne flutes. The room quieted slightly as the wife approached the new female associate. Gavin's eyes darted toward me, a momentary flash of apprehension crossing his features, quickly masked by forced joviality. "Welcome, Daphne," I said, my voice completely devoid of any sharp edges or hidden barbs. I extended my free hand. "Gavin has mentioned your consulting firm. I am Isla. It is a pleasure to finally have you in our home." Daphne looked momentarily surprised by my calm demeanor. She took my hand. Her grip was firm, calculating. "Thank you, Isla. Your home is absolutely stunning. The smell from the kitchen is incredible." "Thank you. We hope you enjoy the evening," I replied, releasing her hand smoothly. I turned my attention back to the other guests, offering to refill Elliot's glass. I saw Gavin visually deflate with profound relief out of the corner of my eye. His shoulders dropped a full inch. He grabbed a heavy pour of bourbon from the bar cart and eagerly joined Ronan in a loud discussion about local zoning permits. He genuinely thought he had successfully navigated the most dangerous part of the evening. He thought the polite, uneventful handshake signaled my complete, naive submission. He firmly believed the dinner would proceed exactly as he had originally envisioned: exquisite food, fortified business relationships, and his ego fiercely stroked by the dual presence of his obedient wife and his shiny new affair. But as I retreated toward the dining room to prepare the first course, I kept Daphne strictly in my peripheral vision. From the very first few minutes, I noticed a distinct, undeniable shift in her demeanor. The brazen, effortless confidence she had carried through the front door began to subtly fracture. She was not socializing blindly. She was actively studying the environment. I watched her stand near the mantelpiece, her eyes scanning the intricate crown molding, the expensive, tasteful art I had personally curated, and the framed photographs depicting a solid decade of a seemingly prosperous marriage. More importantly, she was watching me. She observed the effortless, absolute authority with which I directed the flow of the room. She saw how Miles deferred to me when asking about the evening's schedule, how easily I navigated the complex social dynamics of men who commanded millions of dollars. Gavin had undoubtedly painted a specific, highly edited portrait of me for her during their illicit hotel stays. He likely described a nagging, oblivious, highly dependent woman who simply existed as dead weight in the background of his dynamic life. But standing in my living room, watching me operate, Daphne was beginning to realize the severe discrepancy between his narrative and reality. Her eyes darted from the heavy silver cutlery to my composed, unreadable face. She was a woman who trafficked in image and perception, and she was quickly recognizing that the house she had walked into did not belong to a clueless, helpless victim. She shifted her weight uncomfortably from one stiletto to the other. She took a long, slow sip of her red wine, her gaze lingering heavily on the wooden doors of the kitchen where I stood. She was finally starting to understand that the atmosphere in the room was not being controlled by the loud, charismatic man pouring the bourbon. It was being entirely, methodically controlled by the quiet woman serving the food. At 7:45, I gently chimed a small silver bell, signaling the transition from the living room to the formal dining area. The 13 guests migrated naturally, their conversations softening as they took in the meticulously arranged seating. I had placed Gavin at the head of the long mahogany table, exactly where he believed he fundamentally belonged. I took my seat at the opposite end, the traditional position of the hostess, anchoring the room. I had strategically seated Daphne Vale 2 chairs down from Gavin on his right, surrounded by our most critical financial backers, Ronan Pike and Elliot Shaw. I wanted her deeply embedded in the exact center of the blast radius. Once everyone was seated and the heavy linen napkins were draped over their laps, I signaled the hired servers to begin pouring the reserve wine. The dark, velvety liquid filled the crystal goblets. Catching the ambient light of the chandelier, the atmosphere was incredibly buoyant, radiating the exact frequency of a highly successful partner appreciation dinner. Gavin, incapable of letting a captive audience sit in silence for more than a few minutes, picked up his glass and stood. He adjusted his tailored suit jacket, his chest puffed with an intoxicating mixture of pride and premium bourbon. "If I may have your attention for just a moment," Gavin began, his voice projecting effortlessly down the length of the table. The low hum of chatter instantly died down. "I want to propose a toast. Looking around this table, I see the very foundation of Northbriar Development Group. We are closing out a phenomenal fiscal year, and we are stepping into the next quarter with aggressive, unprecedented momentum. The expansion projects we have lined up are going to redefine the commercial landscape of this entire region." He paused, smiling warmly at the investors, before shifting his gaze slightly down the table toward his mistress. "But a company cannot grow on bricks and mortar alone. It requires vision. It requires a modern, aggressive brand strategy. That is why I am thrilled to have Daphne Vale sitting with us tonight. Her consulting work has already provided invaluable insight into our executive alignment, and she will be a crucial asset as we elevate our public profile to new heights, and to the team that will get us there." "Here, here," Miles rumbled from the center of the table, raising his glass. The rest of the guests followed suit, a chorus of clinking crystal echoing against the high ceiling. I remained seated. I picked up my own glass, holding it delicately by the stem, and offered a soft, perfectly calibrated smile that reached out to every corner of the room. "It is indeed an evening to recognize the true contributions behind the success," I said, my tone light, conversational, and completely devoid of malice. "Every solid structure relies entirely on what is hidden beneath the surface, to the unsung labor that keeps the roof from caving in." A few guests chuckled politely, murmuring their agreement, completely oblivious to the sheer, terrifying weight of the statement. Gavin beamed at me from across the table, taking my words as a charming, self-deprecating nod to my domestic efforts. Daphne took a sip of her wine, her eyes briefly locking onto mine over the rim of her glass. A fleeting shadow of confusion crossed her perfectly contoured face. She was smart enough to catch the strange cadence of my words, but not quite informed enough to decipher the warning. The servers seamlessly cleared the soup bowls and brought out the main course. The braised beef ribs, glazed in the dark bourbon reduction, sat perfectly atop mounds of whipped potatoes, accompanied by the crisp pear and pecan salad. For the next 30 minutes, the dining room was filled with the deeply comforting sounds of an exquisite meal. Silverware clinked against fine china, wine was poured and replenished. The tension I had felt earlier seemed to dissolve into the rich aromas of smoked paprika and roasted garlic. As the plates slowly emptied, the conversation inevitably drifted back toward business. The excellent food and the heavy pours of alcohol had severely loosened Gavin's usual restraint. He was practically vibrating with overconfidence. He leaned forward, gesturing enthusiastically with his fork, treating the dinner table like a corporate boardroom. "The liquidity we are currently maintaining allows us absolute freedom," Gavin declared smoothly, looking directly at Elliot. "We are not just building, we are acquiring. The cash flow is so incredibly stable that we are prepared to fast-track the permits for the downtown high-rise by the end of May." I sat quietly, cutting a small piece of meat, my eyes tracking the subtle reactions of the men he was actively deceiving. I watched Ronan lean back in his chair, his brow furrowing slightly as he processed Gavin's bold claims. "Fast-tracking downtown implies a massive upfront capital expenditure," Ronan noted, his tone casually probing. "Are you absolutely certain the profit margins from the suburban subdivisions are currently robust enough to subsidize that kind of aggressive pivot Without stretching the operating accounts too thin. 100%, Gavin replied without a single second of hesitation. The lie rolled off his tongue with a terrifying, practiced ease. The margins are performing exactly as projected. We have zero substantial dead weight. Elliot, swirling the dregs of his wine, chimed in. I am glad to hear that. Gavin, I know there was a slight delay with the structural engineering firm last month. You smoothed that out with the contractors, I assume? We cannot afford any mechanics' liens dragging down the property titles right before we authorize the next round of funding. Gavin waved his hand dismissively. An arrogant flick of the wrist. A minor administrative bottleneck. Elliot, handled weeks ago. Our contractors are completely satisfied and fully loyal. You have my absolute word on that. I placed my silver fork down on my plate. The metallic click was barely audible, but to me, it sounded like a hammer striking an anvil. He was spinning a magnificent, glittering web of perjury right in front of the very people who held the power to destroy him. At that exact moment, Daphne dabbed her mouth with her linen napkin and sighed happily. Gavin, you were absolutely right. These ribs are incredible. The bourbon glaze is exactly my taste. It has that perfect, sharp bite to it. She smiled playfully at him, a deeply intimate look that bypassed everyone else at the table. It was an offhand compliment, meant to praise the food, but the implications struck me with a startling clarity. Gavin had explicitly instructed me to make this specific dish because he knew exactly how she liked her meat prepared. He knew her palate. He had studied her preferences during their clandestine dinners in Columbus. He had devoted brain space to memorizing the culinary desires of his mistress. In over a decade of marriage, Gavin had never once remembered that I was mildly allergic to raw walnuts, nor could he name my favorite dessert if his life depended on it. He simply ate whatever I put in front of him, assuming my labor was an endless renewable resource. Yet, he had meticulously curated this menu to impress her. It was a microscopic detail, but it solidified the absolute necessity of what I was about to do. Any lingering, pathetic fragment of marital guilt I might have subconsciously harbored evaporated entirely, replaced by a cold, impenetrable steel. The dessert plates had not yet been cleared, but the main course was finished. The guests were leaning back, their postures relaxed, their stomachs full, their defenses entirely lowered by the illusion of luxury and stability. Gavin was mid-sentence, laughing at a joke Miles had just told. Completely unguarded and entirely convinced of his own invincibility. The timing was analytically perfect. I pushed my chair back and stood up. The fabric of my trousers brushed silently against the mahogany table. The movement drew the attention of the room, cutting through the low murmur of conversation. I smoothed my hands down the front of my sweater, offering the table a warm, steady, and utterly composed smile. If I may interrupt the business talk for just a brief moment, I said, my voice carrying clearly over the gentle ambient noise. The 13 faces turned toward me, expectant and polite. Before I serve the peach cobbler, I have something else I need to bring out. A rather special course, prepared specifically for those of you who have placed your absolute trust and your capital into my family. Gavin looked up at me, a confused, indulgent smile playing on his lips. He thought I was bringing out a vintage bottle of champagne, or perhaps a customized gift for the investors. He had absolutely no idea that the dinner service was officially over and the audit had just begun. I turned my back to the dining room and walked deliberately toward the kitchen pantry, ready to serve the truth. I emerged from the kitchen not with the promised dessert, but with a thick, heavy stack of crisp white documents resting against my forearm. The paper was premium stock, substantial and authoritative. I walked clockwise around the perimeter of the grand mahogany table, my footsteps entirely silent against the thick woven rug. Moving with the practiced, unobtrusive grace of a seasoned hostess, I placed a single, neatly stapled packet squarely in front of each guest. I set one down next to Ronan Pike's half-empty wineglass. I slid another perfectly parallel to Elliot Shaw's silver dessert spoon. I placed one precisely in front of Daphne Vale, and finally, I set the last packet directly in front of my husband. The cover page of each packet featured a single, stark line of bold black text, Operational Financial Summary-Internal Review. The atmosphere in the room remained completely relaxed for a few fleeting seconds. The guests, well accustomed to corporate dinners and late evening pitches, naturally assumed this was a highly curated prospectus. They thought it was a tangible, printed roadmap of the grand expansion Gavin had just been boasting about moments prior. Glasses were set down, linen napkins were adjusted. The distinct, crisp sound of heavy paper being turned echoed around the dining room as 13 people simultaneously opened the dossiers. Gavin offered a bemused, slightly tight smile, clearly caught off guard by the distribution of materials he had not personally vetted, but he remained silent, likely assuming I was trying to overachieve in my supportive role by providing visual aids for his fabricated success. That indulgent smile died on his face in less than 30 seconds. I stood quietly at the foot of the table, my hands resting lightly on the back of my chair, and watched the chemical reaction take hold. I did not need to look at the pages. I had memorized every single digit, every damning column, and every fraudulent timestamp. Ronan Pike was the first to hit the invisible wall. As a private equity investor, he did not read words. He read data, and his eyes instantly locked onto the accounts payable reconciliation on page 1. I watched the casual, relaxed slump of his shoulders vanish. His spine snapped entirely rigid. Just 10 minutes ago, Gavin had boldly looked him in the eye and promised that all contractor delays had been fully resolved. The spreadsheet in Ronan's hands, however, clearly detailed a terrifying, cascading list of severely delinquent accounts. He was looking at concrete proof that the structural engineering firm was currently 75 days past due, and the primary concrete supplier had actively threatened to halt all future deliveries just 48 hours prior. Ronan's breathing shallowed. He raised his eyes slowly, the warmth completely drained from his expression, and stared directly across the table at Gavin. Beside him, Elliot Shaw had already flipped to page 2. Elliot represented the institutional capital, the massive loans keeping North Briar afloat. His focus landed squarely on the ledger detailing the owner distribution accounts. The color began to rapidly drain from his face, replaced by a mottled, rising flush of absolute fury. The document explicitly highlighted a continuous, aggressive series of capital withdrawals made directly by Gavin for his personal use. These were not modest executive salaries. They were massive, unregulated hemorrhages of cash, extracted exactly during the same weeks when the company was legally obligated to pay the very contractors Ronan was currently reading about. Elliot was staring at the undeniable proof that his firm's heavily leveraged investment was being actively siphoned into Gavin's personal pockets, while the business's foundational obligations were left entirely unfunded. The final, fatal blow landed at the center of the table. Miles Corbett, the lumberyard owner who had just praised my domestic grace, reached the third section of the packet. This section was a meticulously itemized breakdown of external consulting expenditures. Miles dragged his thick index finger down the column, his eyes tracking the outrageous sums: $5,000, $8,000, $12,000. His finger stopped dead on the vendor name attached to every single one of those bloated, unjustified invoices. Vale Consulting. Miles slowly lifted his head. He did not look at Gavin first. He looked directly to his left, staring blankly at the young, impeccably dressed woman sitting 2 chairs away, Daphne Vale, the woman Gavin had just proudly introduced as a vital, brilliant asset to the company's future. The woman who was, according to the irrefutable banking records sitting on the table, draining the lifeblood out of a company that currently owed Miles over $60,000 in unpaid material invoices. The ambient noise in the dining room did not simply fade. It was instantly and violently suffocated. The soft clinking of silverware against porcelain ceased completely. The polite, low hum of affluent socialization vanished. The silence that fell over the table was not peaceful. It was a heavy, suffocating vacuum, thick with the sudden, collective realization of profound betrayal. Gavin finally looked down at his own packet. He flipped the cover page. I watched his eyes dart frantically across the first few lines of raw data. The blood vanished from his face, leaving his skin a pale, sickly gray. His jaw dropped slightly, his charismatic facade shattering into 1,000 irreparable pieces. He looked up, his eyes wide and wild, darting around the table like a trapped animal realizing the cage door had just locked shut. "Isla," Gavin stammered, his voice cracking, entirely stripped of its former booming confidence. He forced a pathetic, hollow laugh that sounded like dry leaves scraping across concrete. "What is this?" "Honey, you must have printed the wrong files. These look like the extreme stress test scenarios we run for internal auditing. This is not the current summary." His attempt to salvage the situation was incredibly weak. A desperate, insulting lie thrown into a room full of highly intelligent, financially literate men. His excuse died the exact second it left his throat. One of the prospective clients, a sharp-featured man who had been thoroughly charmed by Gavin all evening, dropped the packet onto his plate, narrowly missing his leftover ribs. "A stress test scenario?" the man asked, his tone dripping with absolute, freezing contempt. "Gavin, this timestamp in the upper right corner says this data was pulled from your primary server at 2 o'clock this afternoon. Can you please explain to me, right now, why the actual documented debt load on your flagship project is nearly 40% higher than the numbers you presented to my legal team last Tuesday?" Gavin opened his mouth, but no sound came out. He looked at Elliot. Elliot was glaring at him with a silent, murderous rage. He looked at Miles. Miles simply shook his head, a look of profound disgust washing over his heavy features. Finally, Gavin looked at Daphne. She was staring at the paper in front of her, her face perfectly pale, finally understanding the sheer magnitude of the financial crime she had been unwittingly, or perhaps wittingly, subsidizing. I did not raise my voice. I did not cross my arms or adopt a posture of triumph. I simply stood at my end of the table, projecting the calm, unshakable authority I had built over a decade of silent labor. "There are no printed mistakes on that table," I stated clearly, my voice slicing through the heavy, suffocating silence of the room like a scalpel. "I have personally managed the ledgers, the tax filings, and the corporate compliance for North Briar Development Group for over 11 years. Every single figure, every routing number, and every deficit you are currently reading is a direct, unedited export from the core internal system. It is the exact same system Gavin has historically used to generate your quarterly reports." This was the absolute crux of my design. The most devastating weapon I possessed was not the revelation of his infidelity. If I had simply stood up, cried, and screamed that he was sleeping with the brand consultant, the men at this table would have felt incredibly awkward. They would have lowered their eyes, awkwardly excused themselves, and brushed it off as a tragic, messy domestic dispute that had absolutely nothing to do with their money. Men of their status often looked the other way when it came to personal moral failings, so long as the profit margins remained intact. But I did not give them a domestic drama. I gave them a financial crime scene. By exposing the gross mismanagement of funds, the hidden debts, and the direct funneling of corporate cash to a mistress under the guise of fake consulting fees, I fundamentally altered their relationship to the scandal. I tied their personal wealth, their professional reputations, and their legal liabilities directly to Gavin's deceit. They could ignore a cheating husband, but they absolutely could not ignore an embezzling chief executive officer who was actively defrauding them. I had bypassed the heart entirely and struck directly at the only thing Gavin truly valued, and the only thing these guests fiercely protected: the money, the legal records, and the absolute foundational trust of the boardroom. The heavy silence following my declaration lasted exactly 10 seconds. It was broken by the sharp, violent sound of Gavin slamming his open palm against the polished mahogany table. The crystal wine glasses shuddered, a few drops of dark red liquid spilling onto the immaculate white linen. "What the hell do you think you are doing?" Gavin snarled. The polished, charismatic executive was instantly gone, replaced by a cornered, vicious man. His face was flushed a dark, dangerous crimson, the veins in his neck standing out in sharp relief. By what right do you print out confidential internal documents and distribute them at my dinner table? You are out of your mind. Isla, you have absolutely no authority to share this data with anyone. I did not flinch. I did not step back. I did not raise my voice to match his sudden, explosive volume. I have every right, I replied, my voice perfectly steady and impossibly cold. That right was earned over 11 years of being the actual operational force behind this company. It was earned every single time I forged your signature to approve emergency payroll because you were unreachable on a golf course. It was earned when I balanced the cash flow to cover your reckless overspending, and when I spent 72 hours straight fixing the catastrophic tax errors you made 3 years ago so you would not face a federal audit. I am the only reason there is a company left for you to play president of, Gavin. My name might not be on the corporate letterhead, but my labor is the only thing keeping you out of prison. He opened his mouth to shout me down, to assert his dominance through sheer volume, but before he could form a single word, Ronan Pike cut across him. "Hold on," Ronan commanded. His voice was no longer that of a friendly, affluent investor enjoying a free meal. It was the hard, unforgiving voice of a man who had just realized his wallet was missing. He was dragging his index finger aggressively across the third page of the packet. "Gavin, look at these dates." Ronan looked up, his eyes locking onto my husband with a terrifying, predatory intensity. "These brand consulting payments to Vail Consulting. You authorized a wire transfer of $11,000 on the 14th of October. That is the exact same day you sat in my private office and looked me in the eye, telling me you had to delay the framing crew on the West Side project because the permits were supposedly held up by the city council." Elliot Shaw let out a sharp, incredulous breath. He was rapidly comparing 2 different pages in his dossier. He is absolutely right. There is another payment listed here for $7,200 to Vail Consulting on the 2nd of November. Gavin, that is the exact week our structural engineers walked off the downtown site because their invoices were 90 days past due. The air in the dining room grew instantly toxic. The men sitting at the table were no longer looking at a messy domestic squabble between a neglected wife and an arrogant husband. They were looking at a clear, rigorously documented timeline of corporate financial fraud. They were seeing their heavily leveraged capital being actively diverted from critical, load-bearing infrastructure directly into the pockets of a phantom consultant. Daphne Vail suddenly shifted in her chair. The confident, sleek posture she had carried through the front door had completely evaporated. She looked genuinely panicked, her eyes darting around the table as she realized the sheer, crushing gravity of the room's shifting focus. She recognized that the anger was no longer just about infidelity. It was about grand larceny, and her name was printed on the receipts. She immediately attempted to salvage her own professional reputation. "I assure you all," Daphne said, her voice trembling slightly but attempting to project a hollow authority, "I was legally retained by North Briar Development. I have a signed contract. The consulting fees were for legitimate executive image alignment and hospitality strategy. I provided tangible services. I have absolutely no knowledge of the company's internal payment schedules or contractor disputes." She thought she was creating a sturdy legal firewall between herself and Gavin's gross mismanagement. She thought she could play the role of the innocent, hired third party. She was entirely wrong. Miles Corbett let out a harsh, humorless bark of laughter that echoed off the dining room walls. He reached toward the very back of the stapled packet and pulled out a single sheet of paper that had been appended behind the financial spreadsheets. "Is that what you call it, Miss Vail?" "Hospitality strategy," Miles asked, his voice dripping with absolute, freezing disgust. He tossed the paper onto the center of the table, right next to the ruined plate of beef ribs. It was the printed email thread. "Because this looks like an email from Gavin directly to you, dated the 12th of November, Miles read aloud, leaning forward so everyone could hear him clearly. "Confirming a 2-night stay at the Grand Victorian Boutique Hotel in Columbus. It includes a dinner reservation for 2 and a luxury couple's spa package." And right below the itinerary is the final receipt, charged directly to the North Briar Corporate Platinum Card. The exact same corporate card that Gavin told me was temporarily frozen when I asked him to pay for my lumber shipments. The words hung in the air, heavy and lethal. The final piece of the puzzle snapped violently into place for every single guest present. Daphne was not just the other woman. She was the mechanism through which Gavin was actively embezzling company funds. Whether she knew the full extent of the impending financial ruin or not, she was the direct recipient of stolen investor money, clumsily disguised as a legitimate business expense. She was the black hole swallowing their profit margins. The reaction from the guests hardened into pure stone. They did not care about broken marriage vows or wounded pride. They cared about their money, their legal exposure, and the deeply insulting fact that Gavin had forced them to sit at a table, drink his wine, and break bread with the very woman he was using to drain their accounts. It was a staggering display of disrespect. "This is completely insane," Gavin shouted, his voice cracking with sheer, unadulterated desperation. He stood up abruptly, knocking his heavy wooden chair backward onto the rug. "She has fabricated all of this. Isla is just a jealous, hysterical woman trying to ruin a vital business dinner because she feels neglected at home. Do not look at those papers. It is a pathetic, elaborate attempt to humiliate me." But the more he spoke, the more pathetic he sounded. He was waving his arms, trying to draw their attention away from the undeniable, mathematical proof resting in their hands. He was trying to pivot the narrative back to my emotional state because he could not refute a single line of the data. He could not explain the matching dates. He could not explain the hotel receipt attached to the corporate credit card. "Sit down and shut up, Gavin," Elliot Shaw ordered. It was not a polite request from a colleague. It was a direct, lethal command from a man who realized he was speaking to a massive legal liability, not a business partner. "Do not insult our intelligence by pretending these numbers are fake. I know exactly what our internal ledgers look like. I know your digital signature is attached to every single one of these wire transfers. You have been lying to us for 6 months." Gavin froze, his mouth opening and closing silently like a suffocating fish. The mask of the successful, untouchable executive had entirely melted away, revealing the terrified, pathetic fraud hiding underneath the tailored suit. I looked over at Daphne. She was staring at Gavin as if she were looking at a complete stranger, a monster she had never seen before. The horrific reality of her situation was finally crashing down on her. She had thought she was sleeping with a wealthy, powerful titan of industry who was simply trapped in a boring, loveless marriage. She had thought she was the ultimate prize. Instead, looking at the furious, powerful investors and the catastrophic financial summary scattered across the table, she realized the devastating truth. Gavin was not a millionaire visionary. He was drowning in massive debt. He had lied to her just as thoroughly and casually as he had lied to me and everyone else in this room. He had used her as a convenient, attractive excuse to hide his stolen money, and in doing so, he had just publicly implicated her in a massive corporate fraud scheme in front of the most powerful and vindictive men in the county. Daphne slowly pushed her chair back. She did not look at me. She did not look at the angry investors. She looked solely at Gavin, and the expression on her face was one of pure, unadulterated revulsion. She physically leaned away from him, pulling her arm back against her chest as if the very air around him was highly contagious. She was no longer his ally, no longer his secret confidant. She was simply a woman realizing she was standing on the deck of a rapidly sinking ship, and the arrogant man who had invited her aboard was the exact same man who had drilled all the holes in the hull. Ronan Pike did not raise his voice. He did not need to. When a man who controls tens of millions of dollars speaks softly, the entire room holds its breath to listen. He closed the thick paper dossier, aligning the edges with an eerie, mechanical precision, and placed his heavy hands flat against the mahogany table. "Effective immediately," Ronan announced, his tone possessing the absolute, sterile finality of a judge delivering a verdict. "Every single pending investment agreement between my firm and Northbriar Development Group is indefinitely suspended. I will be contacting my legal team at 8 o'clock tomorrow morning to initiate a comprehensive, independent forensic audit of your entire operation." Until my auditors have scrubbed every single ledger from the past 36 months, you will not see another dime of our capital." Gavin flinched, as if he had been physically struck across the jaw. He reached out a trembling hand, his voice a pathetic, reedy whisper. "Ronan, please, let us sit down in my office tomorrow and look at the real projections. I can explain the temporary cash flow diversions. It is a minor structural deficit." "Do not insult me again," Ronan cut him off, his eyes completely devoid of warmth. "A structural deficit is a market fluctuation. This is systematic embezzlement." Elliot Shaw leaned forward, the wooden joints of his chair groaning under his weight. He bypassed Gavin completely and addressed the room at large, though his furious gaze never left my husband's pale face. "If the internal data Isla has provided tonight proves to be accurate, and given the granular detail of these transaction logs, I have zero reason to doubt it, then we are looking at something far worse than a delayed return on investment," Elliot stated. His voice was laced with a dangerous, razor-sharp edge. "Gavin, you sat in my boardroom exactly 14 days ago. You handed my partners a synthesized financial report that explicitly omitted over $400,000 in vendor debt, while simultaneously hiding your exorbitant personal withdrawals. That is not poor management. That is deliberate, criminal misrepresentation during a capital funding round. You committed wire fraud to secure our last bridge loan." The legal weight of the word fraud dropped onto the dining table like a cinder block. The prospective client sitting near the center, the man who had been poised to sign a massive contract for the new suburban expansion by the end of the week, immediately stood up. He threw his linen napkin onto his half-eaten plate of ribs with a gesture of profound disgust. "My legal counsel insisted on a strict ethics and financial transparency clause in the preliminary drafts of our joint venture," the client said, his face a mask of aristocratic disdain. "I thought it was merely standard boilerplate language. Clearly, they knew something I did not. Consider our negotiations permanently terminated. I refuse to expose my family's trust fund to a man who uses corporate accounts as a personal slush fund to entertain his mistress." The dominoes were falling with spectacular, deafening speed, but the heaviest blow came from the end of the table. Miles Corbett, the lumberyard owner who had known Gavin for over 15 years, did not look angry. He looked fundamentally broken. Miles had attended our wedding. He had been the one to co-sign Gavin's very first commercial equipment lease when North Briar was nothing but a pickup truck and a pipe dream. Miles stared at the beautiful, lavish spread of food, the expensive crystal wine glasses, and the roaring fireplace. He finally looked up at Gavin, his eyes shimmering with a profound, quiet grief that hurt far more than Elliot's screaming fury. "You invited me into your home tonight," Miles said, his voice thick and heavy with sorrow. "You sat me down at your table, you poured me your top-shelf liquor, and you forced me to listen to you brag about your immense success, and you did it all while knowing that you were actively starving my business. You used the money you owed my framing crews to buy her designer clothes and hotel suites. Gavin, you turned your oldest friends into a captive audience for an ego trip built entirely on lies. I cannot even look at you right now." Gavin was drowning in open air. The polished, untouchable facade was gone, leaving only a desperate, suffocating man grasping at the rapidly vanishing pieces of his empire. In a final, pathetic bid for an ally, any ally, he turned his head toward the right. He looked directly at Daphne Vale. His eyes begged her to say something, to validate the lies, to offer some shred of comfort or shared defense in the face of absolute ruin. But Daphne was a survivor in the corporate ecosystem. She instantly recognized the stench of a dying animal. When Gavin reached out his hand toward hers, she instinctively recoiled. The movement was violent, a full-body flinch. She grabbed her sleek leather clutch from the table and pulled her chair back, the wooden legs screeching harshly against the floorboards. She wanted absolutely nothing to do with him. She refused to be anchored to a man who was about to be dragged into a federal courtroom. Her silent, panicked rejection was the final, devastating confirmation of his complete isolation. Throughout the entire execution, I remained standing at my end of the table. I did not smile. I did not cross my arms in triumph. I did not shed a single tear of vindication or let out a breath of relief. I maintained the exact same posture of the polite, attentive hostess I had been when the evening began. "The oven is still warm," I announced, my voice slicing through the heavy, toxic atmosphere of the room. It was perfectly level, devoid of any adrenaline or malice. "I have a fresh peach cobbler prepared for dessert. If anyone would care to stay and finish their meal, you are more than welcome to do so." The sheer, sociopathic tranquility of my offer caused a visible shiver to ripple down Elliot's spine. My absolute composure was the most terrifying element of the entire evening. By remaining perfectly calm, I communicated a truth far more dangerous than if I had screamed and thrown plates. The guests looked at my unreadable expression and collectively realized that this was not a sudden hysterical crime of passion. I had not snapped. I had meticulously calculated this sequence of events over hundreds of hours. I had gathered the data, arranged the seating chart, roasted the meat, and chosen the exact, perfect microsecond to drop the guillotine when Gavin was too arrogant to see the blade falling. No one accepted the offer for dessert. One by one, the most powerful men in the county began to stand up. They buttoned their suit jackets in heavy silence. They did not say goodbye to Gavin. They treated him as if he had already ceased to exist, an infectious disease they needed to immediately quarantine themselves from. As they moved toward the foyer to retrieve their expensive wool overcoats, Gavin stood entirely frozen at the head of the ruined table. His shoulders slumped forward, the expensive fabric of his suit suddenly looking too large for his deflating frame. He finally understood the true architecture of his destruction. The catastrophic documents on the table had not just destroyed our marriage. A divorce would have merely cost him half his assets. Tonight, I had systematically vaporized his professional reputation, his access to capital, his oldest friendships, and the entire ecosystem of blind trust that he had parasitically fed upon for a decade. The mask had not just slipped, it had been violently ripped away and shattered on the floor, leaving him with absolutely nothing but the unpaid bills. The exodus from our home was a masterpiece of agonizing, polite silence. 13 people had sat down to celebrate a grand, fictitious future, but they departed like mourners fleeing a suddenly contagious wake. I stood in the wide archway between the dining room and the grand foyer, my hands clasped loosely in front of me, adopting the exact posture of a gracious hostess, bidding her guests a fond farewell. No one raised their voice. No one threw a punch. The violence of the evening was entirely economic and psychological, leaving the physical space completely undisturbed while the social fabric was shredded into confetti. Ronan Pike and Elliot Shaw retrieved their heavy cashmere overcoats from the hall closet without uttering a single syllable to the man who had invited them. They moved with the brisk, ruthless efficiency of wealthy men who had just narrowly avoided stepping onto a live landmine. As Miles Corbett passed me, he paused. The massive, burly man looked down into my face, his expression a complicated mixture of profound sorrow and deep, reluctant respect. "Thank you for the dinner, Isla," Miles said, his deep voice carrying clearly through the quiet house. "The food was remarkable, but more importantly, I want to thank you for your candor tonight. You saved a lot of good people from going down with a sinking ship." He reached out and gently squeezed my shoulder, a gesture of solidarity that felt heavier than lead. Gavin was standing just 10 feet away, paralyzed near the edge of the dining table, entirely visible and entirely ignored. Miles's quiet gratitude toward me was the ultimate, inescapable humiliation for my husband. It solidified the horrific reality that his closest peers did not view me as a vindictive, hysterical wife ruining a business dinner. They viewed me as a highly competent whistleblower who had just rescued their capital from a fraudster. The last person to reach the front door was Daphne Vale. She had scrambled to gather her belongings, her hands shaking so violently she could barely manipulate the buttons on her sleek designer trench coat. She did not look like a high-powered brand consultant anymore. She looked like a terrified accomplice desperate to flee a crime scene before the federal authorities arrived. She grabbed the brass handle of the front door, pulling it open to let the freezing March wind sweep into the foyer. But before she stepped out into the dark driveway, she froze. Daphne slowly turned her head, looking past me, her eyes locking directly onto Gavin's pale, sweat-slicked face. The illusion of their glamorous, illicit romance had completely evaporated, leaving only the ugly, terrifying reality of grand larceny. "How much of it was a lie, Gavin?" Daphne asked. Her voice was thin, reedy, and vibrating with absolute panic. "How much of all this did you completely lie to me about?" She did not wait for his answer. She did not want to hear another fabricated excuse. She stepped out into the cold night, pulling the heavy oak door shut behind her with a sharp, decisive click that echoed through the sudden emptiness of the house. And then, there were only two. The front door was locked. The driveway was empty. The grand stage had been completely dismantled. The audience had fled, and the true, rotting core of our marriage finally stepped fully out of the shadows and into the center of the room. I turned around and walked slowly back into the dining room. The space looked like a beautiful, macabre museum exhibit of a disaster. The crystal goblets caught the dimming light of the chandelier. Half-eaten portions of expensive beef ribs sat congealing on fine porcelain plates. The thick white packets of the financial summaries lay scattered across the mahogany wood, like the stark, unforgiving relics of a deeply expired marriage. The heavy scent of roasted garlic and brown sugar now mingled with the sour, metallic tang of pure adrenaline and fear. For a long, suffocating minute, Gavin simply stared at the empty chairs. Then, the shock finally wore off, violently replaced by the raw, untethered fury of a narcissist who had just been forcefully separated from his own reflection. He exploded. Gavin grabbed the nearest crystal wine glass and hurled it blindly toward the stone fireplace. It shattered against the hearth with a deafening crash, sending a shower of sharp, glittering shrapnel across the woven rug. The dark red wine splashed against the pristine white mortar like a fresh wound. "You ruined my life!" Gavin screamed, his voice tearing out of his throat, raw and ragged. He lunged toward me, stopping just a few feet away, his chest heaving, his face contorted into an ugly mask of pure hatred. "You completely destroyed me. You sat there. You cooked the food. You smiled at my friends. And you systematically slaughtered my entire career. You betrayed me. Isla, you humiliated me in front of the most important men in this state. You dragged internal, confidential company data out into the open just to satisfy your own petty, jealous vengeance." He was practically hyperventilating, pointing a trembling finger directly at my face. He was throwing every ounce of his energy into playing the victim, desperately trying to construct a narrative where my actions were the primary crime, rather than his years of deceit and financial theft. He wanted me to scream back. He wanted a chaotic, emotional fight so he could drag me down into the mud and prove that I was just as irrational and unstable as he currently felt. I refused to give him the satisfaction of my anger. The icy, absolute calm that had settled over me earlier that morning remained perfectly intact. "I did not humiliate you, Gavin," I replied. My voice was low, steady, and cut through his hysterical screaming like a freshly sharpened blade. "I simply stopped covering your face. I stopped lying for you. The only thing that ruined your life tonight was the exact, verifiable truth of your own actions. You built a magnificent house of cards, and you financed it with stolen money. I just turned on the lights so your investors could finally see the foundation. It was a cash flow strategy," he roared, slamming both fists down onto the dining table, making the silverware jump and rattle. "I was going to pay them all back. You do not understand how corporate leverage works. I understand that you used the drywall budget to pay for a luxury hotel suite in Columbus," I countered flawlessly, my tone completely devoid of pity. "I understand that you authorized wire transfers to your mistress while ignoring the mechanics liens actively threatening our commercial properties. You did not have a strategy, Gavin. You had a parasite, and you fed it with my hard work and Elliot Shaw's money." I turned away from his furious, pathetic flailing and walked calmly into the kitchen. The air here was still warm from the oven. I walked over to the large marble island and opened the top, shallow drawer. My fingers brushed past a stack of takeout menus and rested on the thick, heavy manila envelope I had placed there hours ago. I picked it up, feeling the substantial weight of the legal documents inside, and carried it back into the dining room. Gavin was standing by the table, breathing heavily, his eyes darting frantically around the room as if searching for a magical escape hatch. I walked right up to him and pushed the thick envelope across the smooth mahogany surface. It came to a stop right next to the horrific financial dossier he had failed to hide. "What is this?" he spat out, eyeing the envelope as if it contained a live explosive. "That is the end," I stated simply. He snatched the envelope off the table and ripped the flap open. He pulled out the thick stack of premium legal paper. I watched his eyes scan the bold heading of the first document. It was the formal petition for the dissolution of our marriage, citing irreconcilable differences and profound financial misconduct. But it was not the divorce petition that made the last remnants of color drain completely from his face. It was the second thick packet attached securely behind it. Gavin flipped the page. His eyes widened in absolute paralyzing horror as he read the title. It was a comprehensive, legally binding demand for the equitable division of all corporate assets, accompanied by hundreds of pages of forensic accounting proving my status as the co-creator and primary operational manager of Northbriar Development Group. Gavin had always assumed that if our marriage ever ended, I would be the weeping, broken wife who quietly packed a single suitcase and walked away out of pure shame, perhaps accepting a meager, insulting alimony settlement just to avoid conflict. He firmly believed he held all the power because his name was the only one printed on the primary business licenses. He was incredibly, catastrophically wrong. The documents in his shaking hands detailed my thousands of hours of unpaid labor. They contained the digital logs, proving I had managed the tax compliance, negotiated the vendor contracts, and single-handedly maintained the operational infrastructure of the entire enterprise for over a decade. The corporate attorney I had hired had meticulously woven an ironclad legal argument proving that Northbriar was a joint marital asset, entirely dependent on my sweat equity to function. He looked up at me, his mouth hanging open in sheer disbelief. He finally realized that I was not just leaving him, I was not walking away empty-handed, and I was certainly not walking away in silence. I had meticulously prepared to step out of this house taking my exact, fair share of the empire I had secretly built with my own two hands. I was going to legally dismantle his ownership, piece by piece, dollar by dollar. "You cannot do this," Gavin whispered, his voice completely broken, his arrogance entirely shattered on the floor alongside the crystal wine glass. "You cannot take the company. It is mine." I looked at the man I had served blindly for over 10 years. I looked at his ruined suit, his terrified eyes, and the pathetic, crumbling reality of his existence. I felt absolutely nothing but a profound, sweeping sense of liberation. Tonight was the final, absolute last time I will ever serve your arrogance, Gavin, I said, every word dripping with absolute, freezing finality. From tomorrow morning onward, everything will be priced at its exact, true value. He tore through the remaining pages in the heavy manila envelope with frantic, uncoordinated movements. The thick paper crumpled in his sweaty grip. He had initially assumed the divorce petition was the worst of it, but as his bloodshot eyes scanned the dense legal paragraphs of the subsequent documents, a new, entirely different level of terror washed over his face. He was not just looking at a dissolution of marriage, he was looking at a perfectly orchestrated, inescapable corporate checkmate. "You sent this to a forensic accountant," Gavin choked out, his voice cracking violently on the last syllable. He held up a notarized copy of a certified mail receipt. "You sent our internal financial history to the private auditing firm Elliott uses." "I sent it exactly 2 hours before the guests arrived," I replied, my tone as level and unremarkable as if I were discussing the weather. "I also sent a comprehensive duplicate file to my retained legal counsel. The data is entirely out of our house, Gavin. It is currently sitting in the email inboxes of 3 distinct, highly regulated financial institutions. He dropped the papers onto the mahogany wood as if they were literally burning his fingers. A desperate, frantic energy suddenly seized him. He turned toward the hallway, his eyes wild. He was calculating his next move, the instinct of a cornered animal telling him to run to his home office, boot up the main server, and start permanently deleting the fraudulent routing numbers and fake vendor invoices before Elliot's auditors could officially request the digital hard drives tomorrow morning. I watched him take a half step toward the hall before I delivered the final, crippling blow. "Do not bother rushing to your computer," I said gently. The quiet authority in my voice stopped him dead in his tracks. At 4 o'clock this afternoon, right before I put the ribs in the oven, I initiated a complete administrative lockdown protocol on the central accounting servers. I revoked your executive edit permissions. I locked down the master ledgers, the vendor payment histories, and the internal routing data. You have read-only access now. You cannot alter, delete, or hide a single digital footprint you left behind. The data is preserved exactly as it was when you stole the money. Gavin stared at me, his mouth opening and closing, completely devoid of oxygen. The realization that he had been digitally castrated from his own company finally broke him. And just to ensure my own absolute safety, I continued smoothly, tapping the last page of the document he had dropped. That final letter is a formal, legally binding withdrawal of my name from any and all corporate liability commitments, effective immediately. I am no longer your guarantor. I am no longer your administrative shield. When the federal investigators ask who authorized the diversion of construction loans into a boutique hotel suite, you will not be able to point a single finger at me. The frantic energy evaporated, instantly replaced by a vicious, venomous spite. He took a step toward me, his fists clenched tight at his sides. "I will sue you into absolute poverty," Gavin threatened, his voice dropping to a dangerous, guttural hiss. "You think you can just burn my life down and walk away clean. You are my wife. You manage the books. If I go down for corporate fraud, I am dragging you right down into the dirt with me. The authorities will tear your life apart too." I did not flinch. I looked at the man who had vastly underestimated my intelligence for over a decade. "You do not understand, Gavin," I answered, my voice carrying a profound, untouchable peace. I was only ever afraid of being dragged down into the dirt when I still believed I had a marriage worth protecting. I am entirely free now. My hands are completely clean, and I have the verifiable forensic data to prove it. The threat of mutual destruction had been his final card, and I had just casually flicked it off the table. He saw the cold, impenetrable wall of my resolve, and his entire demeanor shifted in a heartbeat. The aggressive, cornered tyrant collapsed into a pathetic, groveling beggar. His shoulders slumped heavily. He reached out, his hands trembling violently, palms turned upward in a desperate plea. "Please," Gavin whispered, the sound pathetic and hollow in the massive dining room. "Please, we can fix this. I will fire Daphne tomorrow morning. I will never speak to her again. I will sell the boat. I will liquidate my personal stock portfolio, and I will pay back every single dollar to the operating accounts before Ronan's auditors even begin their review. We can start over. Just call your lawyer. Tell them it was a massive misunderstanding. Please." Right at that exact second, as if orchestrated by a masterful, invisible conductor, the heavy silence of the room was shattered by a rapid, relentless series of harsh vibrations. Gavin's expensive smartphone, sitting abandoned next to his ruined dinner plate, began to light up the mahogany table. Buzz, buzz, buzz. He looked down at the glowing screen. The notifications were stacking up one after another in rapid succession. I did not need to be close enough to read the text to know exactly what they said. It was an email from Ronan Pike's legal team, officially demanding a freeze on all joint assets. It was a text message from Elliot Shaw, formally withdrawing his bridge loan. It was an urgent, furious notification from the prospective client, officially terminating their multi-million-dollar expansion agreement. The ecosystem he had so arrogantly exploited was systematically and ruthlessly expelling him. I turned my back to him for the very last time and walked into the kitchen. I opened the warm oven and pulled out the heavy ceramic baking dish. The scent of sweet-baked peaches, melted butter, and warm cinnamon filled the air. I carried the dish out into the dining room and placed it directly in the absolute center of the long table, right among the scattered financial ruins and the half-empty wine glasses. "The peach cobbler," I announced softly, "made exactly the way you requested. This is the only thing I did tonight to serve your specific demands. Every single other thing that happened this evening, I did entirely for myself." Gavin stood completely frozen in the middle of his lavish, quiet house. He looked at the warm dessert, then at the glowing screen of his phone flashing with endless corporate cancellations. He looked at the empty chairs where his most powerful friends and his beautiful mistress had sat just an hour ago. And finally, he looked at me. His career was actively fracturing into a million pieces. His lover had abandoned him at the first sign of legal trouble. His investors were preparing to bankrupt him, and the wife he had treated as a mindless, unpaid servant for 11 years was the absolute only person left in the room whose hands were not shaking. I did not scream. I did not throw the heavy ceramic dish at his head. I did not resort to cheap, violent theatrics or ugly insults. I simply reached into the pocket of my trousers, pulled out the heavy metal keys to my car, and walked toward the front door. I stepped out into the crisp, biting night air, closing the heavy oak door firmly behind me. I drove away toward a quiet, luxurious hotel room I had booked 3 weeks in advance, leaving my husband sitting completely alone at a table set for 13, forced to swallow the one dish he never expected to be served. The absolute truth, delivered exactly on International Women's Day. Several months later, the dust finally settled into a permanent, undeniable reality. The forensic audits initiated by Ronan and Elliott proved entirely fatal to Gavin's reign. He lost the majority of his development contracts, faced severe penalties from the regulatory boards, and was forced to liquidate his remaining personal assets just to keep himself out of a federal penitentiary. The corporate attorney I had retained successfully secured my rightful substantial half of the business equity, proving beyond a shadow of a doubt that my uncompensated operational management was the actual bedrock of North Briar. I did not stay in the suburban house. I sold my half of the estate and took my capital to a different city. Within 5 months, I accepted a senior partnership position at a highly respected private financial firm known as Harbor Ledger Advisory. Looking back at the wreckage of that evening, the lesson was incredibly stark. There are certain men in this world who firmly believe a woman only possesses value when she is standing silently in the background, serving their ambitions without question or complaint. But sometimes, the absolute most elegant, devastating revenge a woman can take is not to serve them anger. It is to simply prepare the truth and serve it at the exact right time, in the exact right place, sitting right in front of the exact right people. Thank you so much for listening to this story today. I would absolutely love to know where you are tuning in from. So please drop a comment below sharing your location and your thoughts on how this dinner party unfolded. If you enjoyed this journey, please make sure to subscribe to the Violet Revenge Stories channel, leave a like on this video, and support us even further by hitting that hype button, so this story can be heard by even more people around the world.